It was a quiet morning like so many others, in the small country house where Carlos had lived for years. The sunlight filtered softly through the thin curtains as he slowly got up, his bones protesting the routine of the day. He glanced at the side of the bed and smiled when he saw Max, his loyal dog, still lying on the rug nearby. Max, now 13 years old, was no longer the young and energetic puppy that Carlos had adopted, but the love and loyalty the dog radiated had never changed. Carlos, now 60, also felt the weight of time on his body. His mornings, like Max's, had become slower. But as usual, he went downstairs, made coffee, and filled Max's water bowl. The dog, struggling to get up, slowly made his way to the kitchen, his body heavy and his movements visibly limited. Carlos watched Max with a mix of tenderness and sadness. He knew that time was passing for both of them, but especially for Max. He knelt down and stroked the dog's now grayish fur, feeling the warmth of his tired body. "One more day, buddy," he said softly. Their routine was simple, but full of meaning. After breakfast, Carlos helped Max outside for a walk in the garden. The dog walked slowly, sniffing the fresh country air, but it was clear his strength was fading. On better days, Max could still walk around the yard, but today he barely managed to circle the house before lying down on the grass. Carlos sat on a nearby bench, watching Max rest. The calmness of the place contrasted with the internal turmoil Carlos felt as he saw his friend weaken day by day. He knew that the moment to say goodbye was drawing nearer, and the idea of losing his longtime companion devastated him. In that moment, as the soft wind rustled the leaves of the surrounding trees, Carlos reflected on the many years he and Max had spent together. Despite the tranquility of the environment, the shadow of the inevitable loomed closer, hovering over their relationship like a distant cloud slowly approaching. Sitting on the garden bench, Carlos watched Max lovingly, and his memories began to flow like a calm stream. He remembered the first time he saw Max, a small puppy lost in a litter of stray dogs. Carlos, going through a lonely period at the time, felt an immediate connection with that brown-furred, curious-eyed puppy. He decided to take him home, and from that moment on, Max had been his faithful companion. In the early months, Max's energy seemed endless. He ran through the fields, splashed in puddles, and got into trouble, destroying shoes and newspapers. Carlos laughed, even when trying to scold the dog for his typical puppy behavior. During that time, the house was full of life, and Max filled a void Carlos didn't even know he had. The loneliness that had once accompanied him every morning began to fade. The dog wasn't just a pet. He had become an integral part of Carlos's life. The memories continued, and Carlos recalled the long walks they took together on the country trails. Max would run ahead, eagerly sniffing everything, while Carlos walked at his own pace, feeling at peace with such a loyal companion. There was one afternoon in particular that Carlos cherished. Max was about 2 years old, and the two of them had spent the day exploring a lake nearby. The dog swam nonstop, returning to shore with wet fur and eyes shining with happiness. Carlos smiled at the memory of having to bathe Max when they got home, both exhausted but happy. These moments, though small, formed the foundation of their friendship. Max was always there in both the good and bad times. He knew when Carlos was sad or worried, lying beside him silently. During a health issue Carlos faced a few years ago, Max refused to leave his bedside, standing guard with attentive and protective eyes. The dog's loyalty was something Carlos would never forget. Now, sitting in the garden with his old companion beside him, Carlos allowed himself a sad smile. Max was tired and aged, but the love between them remained the same. Life had its difficulties, but Max's constant presence had made everything more bearable. The bond they had created over the years was unbreakable, even though time was running out for them. As the sun began to set on the horizon, Carlos looked at Max and quietly said, "Do you remember that lake? We were so young." The dog lifted his gaze as if he, too, remembered it all. And for a moment, Carlos felt that, despite everything, they still had time for a few more good memories. As the days passed, Carlos noticed that Max's decline was accelerating. The dog, who once could walk around the yard, now had difficulty even standing up. His breathing was heavy, and he seemed tired all the time. Every movement Max made was a visible effort, and the look Carlos saw in his friend's eyes was that of a dog struggling to keep going. The veterinarian had already warned Carlos about the signs of Max's advanced age. The arthritis was worsening, and the medications he was taking barely alleviated his pain. Max was also having trouble eating, often refusing even his favorite foods. Carlos knew there wasn't much more he could do, but watching Max in that state was tearing him apart. Carlos spent hours observing Max as he rested, trying to process what was to come. He knew that soon he would have to make a decision that would change his life forever. He couldn't bear the thought of saying goodbye, but he also couldn't ignore the dog's suffering. Each passing day increased Carlos's internal tension, the struggle between wanting to keep Max close and the need to relieve his pain. On a particularly difficult day, Max tried to get up to walk to his water bowl, but his legs gave out. Carlos rushed to help, picking up the dog in his arms and carrying him to the bowl. The scene broke Carlos's heart, and he began to wonder if he was prolonging Max's suffering out of selfishness. He knew the time to make a decision was approaching, but he hesitated. How could anyone decide the fate of their best friend? Despite his limitations, Max still made an effort to stay close to Carlos, as if he wanted to spend every remaining second by his side. The dog still looked at him with the same loving eyes as always, and Carlos felt a tightness in his chest, realizing that even in his weakest moments, Max was still trying to be the loyal dog he had always been. Nights became the hardest moments for Carlos. As Max rested beside him, his labored breathing echoed through the silent house. Carlos spent hours awake, looking at his friend and thinking about what he would do when the inevitable arrived. The thought of losing Max was unbearable, but he knew he couldn't let him suffer much longer. With a heavy heart, Carlos began to accept that soon he would have to say goodbye to his companion. But for now, he would do everything possible to be there for Max, caring for him with all the love he had accumulated over the years. Max's days were slow, and Carlos knew there wasn't much time left with his faithful companion. To comfort himself, he immersed himself in memories of the many years they had lived together. Every memory seemed even more vivid as the end approached. One of Carlos's most cherished memories was of a particularly beautiful summer, when Max was about 3 years old. At that time, the dog was in his prime, full of energy and curiosity. Carlos and Max would leave in the morning and spend the day exploring the fields around their house. Max loved running through the open field, chasing insects, and diving into water puddles as if he were still a puppy. Carlos's laughter still echoed in his memory, remembering how the dog would come back covered in mud, wagging his tail as if he knew he had done something wrong, but without the slightest regret. On one of those summer afternoons, Carlos had taken Max to a small hidden lake in the forest. Max loved to swim, and that day, he swam for hours, returning to shore with wet fur and eyes sparkling with happiness. Carlos remembered thinking on that afternoon how lucky he was to have found such a loyal and lively friend. Life seemed perfect at that moment, and as simple as it was, those days shaped their relationship. Beyond the fun moments, Max was also a great emotional support for Carlos. There was a time when Carlos went through some health issues, and Max never left his side. The dog would lay at the foot of the bed, watching over his owner with attentive and protective eyes. Carlos felt deeply grateful for that constant presence, which made him feel less alone, even in the toughest times. These memories brought comfort, but also intensified Carlos's sadness. He knew the farewell was near, and each happy memory mixed with the pain of the present. However, instead of focusing on the suffering, Carlos decided that Max's last days would be filled with love, attention, and, whenever possible, moments of joy. Before we continue with this exciting story, make sure you are already subscribed to the channel and leave a like on this video to always stay up to date with new content. That afternoon, as Max rested at Carlos's feet, he looked at the dog with tears in his eyes but a smile on his face. "You've always been my hero, you know," he said, stroking the old dog's head. Max lifted his tired eyes and, for a brief moment, seemed to remember all the happy days they had shared. The sun shining through the window lit up Max's now grayish fur, and Carlos, though saddened, felt warmth in his heart. Even with the end approaching, Carlos knew that the love and memories he and Max shared were eternal. And although the pain of loss would be great, it would never erase the happy moments they had lived side by side. The days grew heavier for Carlos. Each morning, he looked at Max, trying to convince himself that his friend was holding on. But reality was relentless. Max could barely walk anymore, and sometimes he couldn't even stand up without Carlos's help. The old dog spent most of his time lying down, breathing heavily, and his eyes, once bright with joy, now seemed tired, as if time had drained all his energy. On one particularly cold night, Max had a serious relapse. Carlos woke to the sound of the dog panting heavily, struggling to breathe. He got up quickly and ran to Max, kneeling beside him. Kneeling on the living room floor, Carlos placed his hand on Max's chest, trying to comfort him. The dog was trembling, and his body felt weaker than ever. In that moment, Carlos knew the situation was worse than he had wanted to admit. Carlos stayed by Max's side throughout the night, offering soft words and gentle strokes on the head, as the dog lay in his lap, as if he knew the end was near. It was a quiet night, except for the muffled sounds of Max's irregular breathing. With tears in his eyes, Carlos spent the night mentally replaying every moment they had lived together. He knew he was facing a terrible but necessary decision. Max no longer had the strength to go on, and keeping him in that state of suffering would be selfish. The next morning, Carlos got up, determined. The moment had come. He called the vet and explained the situation with a choked voice. The vet, understanding, offered support and scheduled the final appointment for that afternoon. Carlos hung up the phone and stood still for a moment, the house completely silent. He knew this would be the hardest farewell of his life. When the time came, Carlos carried Max in his arms with all the care in the world. The dog, who had once run through the fields, was now quiet and vulnerable, nestled in his owner's arms. On the way to the vet, Carlos could barely speak. The weight of the decision crushed him, and his heart was broken, but he knew he was doing what was best for his friend. Max had given him years of love and loyalty, and now it was Carlos's turn to repay that kindness by giving him a dignified, painless farewell. The veterinary clinic was calm when Carlos arrived. The vet was waiting for him and, with a gentle gesture, showed that he was ready to help Max rest. Carlos, however, couldn't avoid the lump in his throat as he held the old dog in his arms for the last time. He sat next to Max, tenderly stroking his head, and whispered words of gratitude. "Thank you for everything, buddy. You were the best I could have asked for." Max looked at him, still with that look of loyalty he had always offered Carlos, and for a brief moment, he seemed at peace. The procedure was brief, but for Carlos, it felt like an eternity. When it was over, Max rested peacefully. Carlos held his pause until the last breath, his heart devastated but relieved knowing Max's suffering was finally over. The silence in the veterinary clinic room was heavy. Carlos still held Max in his arms, feeling the weight of the sudden absence, as if the world around him had frozen in time. Max's body, now lifeless, felt so light, but Carlos's pain was immeasurable. He knew he had done the right thing, that Max was finally at peace. But it didn't lessen the crushing void that began to grow inside him. With the vet's help, Carlos said his final goodbye to Max. The old dog had been his most loyal companion throughout all those years, and now He had to find a way to move forward without his constant presence by his side. Every moment spent with Max echoed in Carlos's memory. The long walks, the knowing glances, and even the quiet nights they shared, where simply being together brought a peace that few words could describe. The drive home was quiet. Carlos drove slowly, looking out the window as the familiar countryside passed by. There was no longer the sound of Max's paws in the back seat, nor the joyful company he always offered on trips. When he arrived home, Max's absence seemed amplified by the stillness of the house. Every corner bore Max's mark: the rug where he used to lie, the water bowl, the door he nudged with his nose when he wanted to go outside. Carlos spent a few moments alone, feeling the emptiness that now filled his home. He sat on the couch, holding Max's collar, the last physical reminder of his old friend. The tears came silently, and for the first time since the farewell, he allowed himself to cry. As the hours passed, the sadness began to transform into a kind of peace. Max was no longer suffering, and Carlos knew he had done the right thing, even though it had broken his heart. The pain of loss was inevitable, but deep down, he felt that Max was in a better place, running free as he had in his youth. In the days following Max's farewell, the dog's absence was palpable. Every corner of the house and garden felt empty without him. But Carlos knew he couldn't live in sadness forever. There was something he needed to do, something that would honor Max's memory in a meaningful way. And that's when he had the idea to plant a tree in the field where they had so often walked together. The choice of location came naturally. It was a special place, a secluded corner of the field where Max always loved to run, sniff around, and lie beneath the trees. In that peaceful area, Carlos felt at ease, and he knew Max would find rest there too. In that patch of land, the tree he would plant would be a living symbol of the friendship they had shared for so many years. That afternoon, Carlos picked up a small tree sapling and went out to the field. The sky was clear blue, and a gentle breeze blew, as if even nature wanted to say goodbye to Max. He began digging into the soft soil, feeling the weight of the shovel in his hands, but also feeling a slight relief in his heart. It was as if this act of planting the tree was a form of healing, a way to continue their story in a different way. Carlos planted the sapling carefully, filling the hole with soil, and then sat beside it, watching the small shoot that would one day grow strong. He knew that as the tree grew, it would become a symbol of renewal and remembrance. In that moment, Carlos felt a lightness he hadn't felt in days. Max was gone, but in some way, he would always be present in memories, in their hearts, and now in that field. The tree would be a place of visit, where he could recall the happy days and feel that, in some way, Max was still there, running by his side. The days passed, and Carlos, despite the pain, began to find peace in his new routine. The tree he had planted in Max's honor was slowly growing, and as it grew stronger, he too felt stronger. But the silence in the house was still hard to bear, and over time, Carlos realized that his life had always been better with a companion by his side. A few weeks later, he visited an animal shelter, not to replace Max, but to offer a home to another dog in need of love and companionship. It was there that he met an energetic puppy with bright eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging. It was a new opportunity to share his life with another loyal friend. Bringing the puppy home, Carlos felt a mix of sadness and joy. Max would always be in his heart, but now there was room for a new friendship. When they arrived at the field where he had planted the tree, the puppy ran happily, while Carlos watched, smiling softly. Life continued, and with it, the certainty that the love between humans and dogs never fades. It simply transforms and renews. Thanks for watching until the end. What did you think of today's story? Leave your opinion in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Until next time.